Good morning, NBC OC church family and others that might be listening to this lesson. Don't know what date it'll be run. I'm recording this as sort of a backup for the team that makes these videos. And as a guy who spent way too many years down in the deep brush country of South Texas, I always appreciated having a spare or two around, especially in tires and batteries and things, because down there, Sunday's news shows up about Thursday, so I'm not sure when this might be used. Maybe won't be, but in the event it is, I'm not going to make any reference to current events because they may not be relevant by the time it gets around. My intent today is to present a little bit of information out of an occurrence found primarily in Acts chapter 16 that in my way of looking at things, it represents just about the most important question that any individual can ask as it relates to coming to know Christ. And I fully understand that such a topic could be interpreted in a variety of ways, and I always used to tell my classes when I would teach the teacher kind of classes that they got to remember that everybody's not going to see what you hope to present in the way you did. Remind me of that from a country preacher who was wanting to do a sermon on lifestyles, making good choices in your lifestyle. He brought out for his illustration that day a jar full of whiskey, drinking whiskey, a jar full of cigar smoke, and a jar full of best deep dark chocolate he could find, and a jar full of good rich earth out of one of the fertile soils in the neighborhood. Two into each of those enclosed bottles, he unscrewed the lid and put in an earthworm, and then proceeded to put the 4 bottles underneath his podium and conducted his lesson, gave his lesson. At the end, he brought them back out, and sure enough, no surprise, in the whiskey was a dead worm, and the chocolate was a dead worm, and the cigar smoke was a dead worm, but the worm in the fertile soil was healthy and happy and moving around. He said, well, so what's your conclusion? Old farmer in the back stood up and said, well, Doc, Reverend, I think what you're telling us here is that if we drink enough whiskey, eat enough chocolate, and smoke enough cigars, that we'll never have worms in our body. I'm pretty sure that wasn't what the preacher intended for them to get out of the message, but nonetheless they did. So before we get started today, let's go to God in prayer. Father God, thank you for the day, and I pray that this lesson will be worthwhile and beneficial to those that hear it. I ask your blessings, guide my words, make them germane, make them encouraging, make them thoughtful. Father, be with our elders and our staff, the wonderful people who work so very hard for us, for those that we love and care about, with the leaders of not only our community, but those in the world, that they may come closer to know you and to reach a time where we can have more peace and agreement between each other. Thank you for your love, thank you for your blessings, and mostly thank you for your Son Jesus, who you sent for us. And it's in his name and on his behalf we pray to you. Amen. Okay. So the question that's asked today in Acts 16 was asked in this recording by a person under great stress in the ancient city of Philippi over 1900 years ago. And as a guy that's studied and taught and practiced and written and spoke about real estate for well over 50 years now, notice I never did say I did it well, that I want to give a little historical and geographic background about this city before we get into the lesson too far. So what we know from our reading here, although it was called a different name then as Philippi, was established about 400 years before Christ. And about 50 years later, around 350, Maecenas, King Philip II of Macedon conquered it, and he named it Philippi. Now, I don't have to wonder too long, even slow as I am, where he got that name from. But the goal was to control, even before Roman rule, um, what they call the road trade route that was used to protect the mining from the gold mines that were in the area. Now, I want to keep in mind as it relates to this story and even further towards the end of the lesson, I'll tell you that those excavation activities at the time, which I'm sure didn't give much concern to geological structures, um, might have led to some of the problems that occurred for this location over the years. So when the Romans conquered this about the 2nd century BC, they resettled it. Resettlement in those times meant they probably converted the natives to slaves and sold them, or they killed them. But in any case, what they did was they resettled this area primarily with military veterans from an elite group of retired people who worked in what's called the Praetorian Guard, Praetorian. The Praetorian Guard was the soldiers who were charged with the responsibility of protecting and being information gatherers, intelligence officers, if you will, for Roman generals, for the Roman Senate, for the royal family, and then for area government. So they were kind of the CIA, Secret Service, FBI all rolled up into one. The reason that this area was so important even before, but certainly to Rome, was the fact that it represented not only a source of transportation for gold, but it was also the trade route that led from Neapolis, Neapolis. And Neapolis was an ancient city where the largest collection of salted fish and then a fermented fish sauce called gaum, G-A-U-M, was produced. So between the fish, the sauce, and the gold, there was great wealth that traveled up and down the road that led through Philippi. And so the Romans created a garrison there, settled by the people we made reference to. It was considered to be what might be called Little Rome at this time, where these events are recorded. And we know that Paul came to Philippi around 49 or 50 A.D., and this is recorded in Acts 16, verses 6 through 15. And this was part of his 2nd missionary trip, and his preaching there represents the first time that the gospel was ever presented on European soil. The Gospel of Philippians was written somewhere around 61, 62, 63 AD. And I encourage you to read that entire book after thinking about and listening to this information today, because it certainly might cause you to look at it in a different way. I know it did for me. So the main characters in this event, they included Paul, Silas, and then the Roman jailer. Now I'm going to speak more about 2 and 3 than I was putting down Paul. So Silas was a Hellenist, Hellenist. A Hellenist. He was also a leader in the early church, and of course, obviously, was one of the missionaries. The term Hellenist means that he was Greek in the language that he spoke, the lifestyle that he lived, and the outlook he had on the world. But he was not of Greek ancestry, so his bloodlines didn't run in the Greeks. So 1 Peter 5 and 12 refers to him as Silvanus. He's introduced in Acts 15:22, where he goes with Paul and Barnabas and Barsabbas, all of them being leading men among the brethren. to go to Antioch. Victor, I'm going to take a small break, get my next round of papers here ready to go. So I've got some editing here to do. I'll do this probably 2 or 3 times in this talk. And I'll try to give you enough lead time always to not have to jiggle too hard to get it out. Okay, so I'm getting ready to start again. Okay, so we also know regarding Silas from Acts 16 verse 37 that he was a Roman soldier, which meant that the treatment he and Paul received was illegal and could have caused some great problems for those responsible for allowing it to happen. But you've got to keep in mind that Rome was all about law and order, as long as it was their law and order. So we'll see more about that in a minute. So this whole story really began when Paul saw a vision, a man begging him to come to Macedonia. Verses 9 and 10 speak about that. And it says that immediately they responded. Now, I don't know if that means they dropped everything and went that same next day or something, but it certainly does imply that they didn't have 27 board meetings and 19 committee meetings and 16 resolutions for it to happen. They got up and went pretty quick. And it says that when arriving at Philippi, that they went outside the gates, that's the word they use, outside the gates along the riverside. Now, think about that a minute from a geographic point of view, a strategic point of view. Not only was this road here for economic purposes, but the fact that it had a river for sources of water and that it was gated suggests that it had some security as well. So clearly it was a pretty important place. So they met there Lydia, who becomes, of course, as many of you know, a very important early leader, member of the young church. She was, if you recall, a materials broker. And it says that she and her whole household were baptized. Now that'll be an important term, whole household, later on in this talk. So, not long after getting there, Paul and Silas ran into this slave girl who was a sort of a fortune teller. She had the spirit of divination, divination, divination is how it's referred to in my Bible's translation. And Mr. Webster in his dictionary says that divination is defined as that of communication with a deity for purposes of predicting future occurrences. Now, this slave girl was being, in today's vernacular, trafficked for great profit by her owners and her masters. So the story says that she followed around, chased after Paul and Silas, proclaiming that they were servants of the Most High God who proclaimed to us the way of salvation. I guess she must have for sure had some sort of insight to be able to pin them so carefully. And the scripture says she did this for many days. Now, I got to think about old Paul here for a minute. You know, there was times in Paul's life when he was known to not be particularly patient. You know, he could have a pretty short fuse. He kind of reminds me a good deal of some of the old German farmers and ranchers I grew up around. And so it says he got greatly annoyed. Boy, I understood how to greatly annoy people when I was a kid, maybe still to this day. He got greatly annoyed with her racket. That's my word, her racket. And he told the spirit in her, in the name of Jesus Christ, to come out of her. Well, under that edict, the spirit left her, removing her income potential, earnings potential for her owners. And of course, they reacted in a very negative way and ended up dragging the 2 apostles into the marketplace before the magistrates. Now, before we get into the magistrates, I want you to think about the public arena where they kind of held court, so to speak. the front gates of the public marketplace. And you think about how many towns in both South and Central Texas that have a courthouse with a public park or a courtyard park out in front of them. Real pretty settings, some of them. And so this idea about magistrates in the Old Testament times, both in Ezra 9:2 and Nehemiah 2:16, 4:14, and 13:11, for examples, the magistrates term referred to nobles and leaders. In the New Testament times, they were referred to as the archon, A-R-C-H-O-N, archon, not too sure, A-R-C-H-O-N, which could be translated as first in powers or rulers, and sometimes they even term as authorities. And we can see that in Luke 12:58 and Titus 3:1, for examples. Now, there was, according to the scripture, there was quite an uproar going on here, and a whole lot of accusations were made about these two gentlemen. Of course, there was no evidence or proof, which, of course, we unfortunately see even today. Sometimes you can make all kinds of statements and accusations, and without benefit of proof. That's a little different way to look at it. But the net result is the magistrates ordered that they be beaten with rods and thrown into the innermost dungeon of the jail with their feet put in stocks. Verses 22 through 24 record these events. Now, a little explanation here. Rods in this time could be referred to something like a shepherd's rod, which would be a thick piece of wood that they would use for defensive purposes, a walking stick, pretty stout. You could also think of rods as sort of like a fishing rod, which would have a little bit of give and bend to it. And more likely, the wooden rods that were used to inflict punishment were more like the fishing rod. They were a little more limber. They had a little bend to it. Could conform to the anatomy of a person. In contrast to a thicker, heavier wooden rod or even a metal rod, which had little give to it, you could easily break severe the spinal cord of someone if you struck them on the back, and that would result in a disabled person unable to walk, which was not the intent. The intent with this was to inflict pain, not to disable the person or to kill them. Because if you want to kill them, you could have done it in some whole lot easier ways than that. Now, these stocks they referred to were generally rough, heavy wood with 2 to 5 holes cut in. Placement of feet, of hands, of the neck, or all the above, depending on the time and the culture, were utilized. We even today refer to as a fortress kind of thing, sometimes as going to the stockade. But nonetheless, this was a very uncomfortable physical position to be in, especially when you consider that these poor guys had just been whipped, beaten about their backs and legs, and so they were likely sitting or laying down in some distress, physical distress. And think about the rough, dirty ground that they were on. You don't have to be too imaginative to consider what kind of environment they found themselves in. The innermost dungeon, where lack of lighting, of sanitation, of ventilation would all be possible. So tough place to be. Just a little small rabbit trail here to chase for a second, but hopefully gives you some greater context to this information. Rome did not invent torture, but they made great strides in the design and execution of it. Their main goal in using such brutal tactics was fear and intimidation. For example, some of the historians I studied in trying to prepare semi-qualified and reasonably explained lesson for you today was that it was common practice when Roman soldiers conquered a city, a town, to uh, execute in the form of crucifixion 10, the first 10 men they ran into. Now these weren't necessarily enemy soldiers or rebels. These were just simply inhabitants that were unfortunate enough to be taken. And I'm not going into any of the gory details. There's some of it's explained in the story about what they did to Christ. But the bottom line is this was a horrible process. And the use of such torturous things was designed to instill orderly control of the citizens. So the punishment that Paul and Silas received, as bad as it was simply the first step in the Roman well-designed plan of control through fear, intimidation. The problem was, of course, in this case, that it's apparent that they found out after the fact that both Paul and Silas were Roman citizens. And Roman citizens, as determined as the Roman government was to control what they conquered, they were equally fervent in their control of protection of the citizens. And so no citizen could be punished without the use of a fair trial. And even if the trial resulted in a verdict that was disagreeable to the Roman citizen, they had the right to appeal to Caesar, and their trial would be reheard in Rome, much like an appellate court kicking it up to the Supreme Court, if you will. Now, Paul, in fact, learned that lesson, I guess, maybe from right here, for what happened to him, because as you recall, in later years, he did appeal and was sent to Rome, where he was under house arrest, possibly in prison as well. In violation of this protocol by the magistrates could result in, first of all, them being dismissed from a high power of authority, second, being punished, or third, being killed, and potentially even their own families. So you can see that this caused some problem a little bit later, but that's not the real focus of this story. So this situation that Paul and Silas found themselves in would have caused me, I must confess, to react in a very different way than they did. These great men of God, it says in verse 25, were there singing and praising God, and the prisoners were hearing them. Now, I got to believe part of the design of this very crude, rude place with jail, bars, gates, whatever, doors, would have included the ability to hear the torture, the moans, the groans, the crying of other prisoners, which would have had a psychological impact on those in prison. And so the fact that they were hearing these guys, instead of doing what most people would be doing, hearing them singing praises and praising that they were worthy enough to be punished in the name of God, it had to have an impact on the prisoners to some extent. And it says that a great earthquake created quite a change in this situation, and that the foundations were shaking. Now think about it, these guys are in the innermost section, they're underneath, it's called a dungeon, and so the fact that the earth could collapse on them was much greater a fear than if they'd been outside and about. So it does say that the doors flew open, the chains fell off in verse 26. So just a little another side note, the city of Philippi was destroyed by an earthquake somewhere around 400 years after these events are recorded here. And so we can say that this geological experience that these guys were going through wasn't the only time that had occurred. at this particular site location. So keep in mind that this jailer, who very likely was a retired soldier, who had been given this probably very good position because of his loyalty, his experience, his leadership, a lot of positive things. He knew the consequences of losing just one prisoner. Roman rules for their soldiers was pretty severe if you lost a prisoner. There are other stories about soldiers being bribed related to Jesus' resurrection, but in other cases where they were, quote, investigated, they were examined, I think is the word that's used, which meant, of course, that they were punished severely. So this guy's probably thinking, I'm going to kill myself and not go through the torture that will ensue when I am found guilty of losing a whole collection of prisoners. Because it later says, talks again like in Lydia's case and his household, it could be that he had servants he cared for, could have had a family. We don't know the details, but his household also is referenced. And so I only speculate that he was gambling, that maybe this action would mitigate the negative impact on others he cared for beside himself. But Paul yelled out and said, man, don't hurt yourself. We're all here. Now, I'm not going to spend any time trying to speculate on where the rest of the prisoners remained. Only I'm going to say all the doors were open and all the chains were off the prisoners. So once this soldier, he got this light, because remember, this was a dark dungeon. There was no lighting in there. He fell on his knees trembling. I'm sure those words were not by accident. Now, was the reaction one of relief, fear, confusion? I'm not sure. But the words he uttered were some of the most important ones that any human being can ask. Now, I'd like to break his very earnest question down into some kind of a detailed analysis. Well, full disclosure, I ask you to keep in mind that, man, I'm not an authority in very much at all, maybe nothing. And I'm certainly not one in the English language, but I think if we just take this one word or one phrase at a time, maybe we can get an expanded meaning out of it. At least I'm going to try. I hope it's successful. First word was what. Now, what can be have multiple implications, but in this case, it's the writer smarter than me say it's an interjection, which is used to express an emotion such as surprise or fear. I gotta believe in this case that this jailer is brimming full of all kinds of emotion. Must. This word can be used likewise in a whole lot of ways, but here though, I'm pretty sure it's reflecting the issue of necessity. There's no rhetorical implications or mocking involved. It's a laser-focused desire for exact instructions. Remember, this guy's a soldier. He's used to taking orders. He's used to knowing what he's supposed to do and implementing them. I do. What must I do? Well, this request is not only explicit, it's highly self-centered and implies a direct requirement of action for the responding party. There seems to be absolutely no, let me think about it, give me my choices, what are my options? This jailer, very likely a hardened personality, had experienced a significant amount of trauma and war and killing and all the things that went along with being a Roman soldier in that time. He's asking this at a very highly personal level. What must I do? Well, the last part, of course, implies a direction, and it's to be saved. And like many of you, I have known boatload of career military professionals, and I've been blessed to know most of them over the years. And this, like them, this guy is very mission focused. You know, he's all about carrying out or fulfilling the mission, and he's hard. That stuff's hardwired in his DNA. So the recognition of a powerful force in some way connected to Paul and Silas is abundantly clear to this guy. And I'd like to speculate that he may get a more mature and expanded perspective later on, but right now he's very, very much on target for himself. What must I do to be saved? I think that the jailer recognizes that this is far beyond his capability and capacity to understand, and but he is willing to believe with what he sees with his own eyes, and like many other human beings, recognizes that he's witnessed something here that will impact him and be with him the rest of his life. So I think that right now he's just thinking about him. I don't think he's even considering the implications of having to report this experience to the jailers, to the Roman officials. I think all that's a backseat. And I'm reminded that many people are led in a much longer and more winding route to salvation than this guy went through. But it don't matter how long it took or the ways you got there. Um, it seemed to me that anybody that desired to be a saved child of God, they must confront the question, maybe posed slightly differently, but the same question that this jailer asked. Now, like many of you, I'm coming to this important milestone of questioning uh, from the perspective of having been there and done that years ago. But I think implied upon us so-called veterans that we must be prepared to reply in a manner that accurately reflects uh, the next step of the salvation process. And I realize that not very many of us that are listening to this will have much in common with Paul and Silas in terms of the experiences they had on this here in Philippi, much less in the rest of their lives. But our behavior and modeling to those we come in contact with can be tremendously supportive or distracting from God's plan. I've heard all my life been talking about a respected, qualified, mature Christian that that person walks the walk. I think that's a great compliment. So, besides the compliment of walking the walk, I'm reminded that for around 25 years of my earlier life, I've spent a good many days in a kitchen that had a small plaque on it. It's always stuck with me. And the plaque read, "Maybe I cannot do big things in a big way, but I can do small things in my way to show the love of Christ." Seems to me that's a mighty fine way of looking at what we can all strive to do a better job at in terms of helping people get to the question that jailer asked. Of course, there's much more to this story than we've tried to do today, but I'd like to let you know before ending that Philippi, through the impact of Paul and Silas, Miss Lydia, and very possibly this jailer, ended up being one of the centers of Christianity in that part of the world. Um, there was at least 6 or 7 Christian churches that were found in the remains of the city when it was unearthed, starting in the 15th and going all the way through the 17th centuries. So some good things came out of it. So to God be the glory, and sincere thanks to people like Paul and Silas and Lydia and that jailer who got it all started, at least for those folks. and maybe we can help get started for somebody else. So thank you for listening today. I hope time you spent with me was of some small encouragement and reflection about an important question that remains relevant even today. Thank you. Blessings to all. Bueno. Bye.